various forms of corruption, manipulation, even violence. Actually, that dawn of liberal democracy was nothing like the new dawn of some widely accepted and model democratic politics that was imagined. We have neoliberalism and neoliberalisation. I mean, we are really, the world is neoliberalised. The global neoliberal agenda transforms the world. Struggled in our salvation. We need this concept of civil society. This concept is really important to us. We need to recognise what's going on outside this state. And then we have the emergence of all kinds of social movements in that period as well, which C&D was obviously an extremely important one, a peace movement. We've had other histories of peace movements, but it became extremely important in that period. And challenges to sexism, racism, homophobia, and what I think is incredibly important, the de-sanctioning of certain violences. So when I look back and I think my brothers were beaten at school, and there was child abuse was not talked about. We're now exposing what some celebrities were involved in terms of child abuse, which was simply taken as normal behaviour. We had, when I grew up, rape was not possible in marriage, it wasn't recognised. We've had recognitions of these acts of violence as violence, and it feels to me like there's been a de-sanctioning, if you like, in some parts of the world which has had the possibility of influencing others. So in other words, we have had in that period some really interesting tools, very important tools if we're going to think of politics for future peace, that haven't transformed the world, but have given us ways in which we might think about politics. Now, so here we are now. Democracy really world, actually authoritarianism is as compatible with neoliberalism. I would not. And China is now recognised as having got it's a capital form of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, but state-directed capitalism. And that tells us that actually authoritarianism can work with neoliberalism. And that's a really worrying thing that we have to. The levels of inequality. This is quite extraordinary, I think, what we've got to today, 2014, from that moment, 1945, when I think on the agenda was equality and inequality were on the agenda. And I consider myself a daughter of the efforts to bring greater equality to the world. My father was a printer, trade unionist. I was the first generation to go to university, certainly the first generation of women to go to working class women to go to university. And what do we have now? 85 people across the globe with a wealth of $1 trillion, as much as the poorest 3.5 billion. In the UK, the 5 richest families wealthier than the 20% of the entire population. What does that mean in terms of politics? It means, as Oxfam, who part of those statistics puts it so well, the wealthier you are, the more you capture the opportunity. And that is politics. So the wealthier you are, you capture the opportunity. And I think so much has come out recently, the way corporations actually manage to have these tiny, cosy relationships with various elites around the world. And that anti-democratic, deeply anti-democratic coziness between corporate power and political power. This is where we've got to 2040, even though we've had social movements in society, we've had all those efforts towards peace on the agenda to desanction violence. This is what we've got. We have the rise of the middle class around the world. Right? Even my area, Latin America, one of the most unequal in the entire world, now has a very significant middle class. And the middle class have won some share of the world income. But what is it about? What is its that middle class is also a precariat, as it's called, a class that lives precariously. Right? This isn't a game of security as the working class of my generation, my father, who was a printer, would always have a job of life, for life. Now, his daughter would live in precariat. Well, so it's quite interesting when one looks at Brazilian protests of last year, the Turkish protests of last year, to know how many middle-class people went out into the streets. Actually, that precariat is a class that actually is very aware of the challenges it faces under neoliberalism. But of course, middle class also buys into the system, so it goes both ways. But I think very interesting in Brazil, which is a country I've worked on for a long time, and where it has a whole history of social movements that help bring down the dictatorship. In Brazil, it's been the middle class that played an absolutely leading role in questioning the World Cup and the way that, not the question of the World Cup, I like the World Cup, but the way that money to build big stadiums has been used and abused, stadiums that will be built that will never be used, in a country which still has major problems of simple transport infrastructure, the efforts to pacify the favelas, the slums of Rio, in order to clear the way for the people who come to the World Cup and the Olympics. It's been middle class people who gone out. So we've got this rise of middle class, but they go both ways. Precariat, some of them rebel, but people also buy into the system. With the rise of the discarded, right? And I've titled this slide, Citizen Consumers and Outcasts. The people who actually are discarded by capital. And the floating graveyards, these incredible images we have on the television of the boats that are bringing desperate people into the West, the so-called developed world, or the dangerous journeys. Channel 4 at home doing a fantastic thing, trying to show the dangerous journeys of migrants. But you only have to kind of see the read the prices every day. Not long ago, the numbers who died crossing the desert in Africa to try and get to the coast, to try and get onto leaky boats and then come to the north. So we've got the discarded and the outcasts there. We have the rise, and again I feel this very strongly because of Latin America, because I work in Colombia, but the rise in illegal economies and parallel authorities in many parts of the world. But in Latin America, Colombia, moment trying to go through a peace process, place like Medellin, go into the comunas of Medellin, and actually those comunas are controlled by parallel authorities that make their money through all kinds of illegal trafficking. And if we actually look at the world today, these traffickers take advantage of those outcasts, quite often poverty, which leads people into these other alternatives. And we have the anger of the outcasts. It's an anger. Is it resistance? Is it political? We've never, I think, found in this country a way of talking about the riots of 2011 as to actually what they represented. What kind of an anger was expressed there? Yes, it was expressed by looting. It wasn't expressed in politics, right? Looting because looting actually, that kind of consumption is part of what is generated by the world we're living in. But it reflects that depoliticisation, that deep depoliticisation. So we have resistances of a kind, but no revolution. So where does this leave us thinking about where to go from here? Where can we possibly deal with these problems of violence? How do we think about peace? What are our next steps? Well, Steven Pinker has written this mammoth book, maybe some of you have read it, Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he comes up with five components which he thinks are responsible for the decline of our violence. Right? Which, in my terms, would mean something about moving closer towards peace. He makes a very persuasive quantitative case for the decline of violence measured in homicides, right? We are on the way to civilizing ourselves. We are going towards that moment of politics of peace. So he talks about the Leviathan. He says the state is actually, there's probably arguably the single most important factor in the reduction of violence. And we even define the state in terms of the monopoly of legitimate violence. So we give the state the only legitimate use of violence. And yet, when we look around us, we see how much the state is actually reproducing violence. How that has not given us tools to really understand what happens when the state commits acts of violence. So, when I hear, just the other week, last week I think, about the cases of abuse by British and American soldiers and Iraqi prisoners. I hear about the states that are supposedly very legitimate in terms of their monopoly of violence still using torture. I think, well, does that Leviathan, how exactly, obviously, Pinker's got some very important points to say, that unless you have a state that functions, yes, very difficult to reduce violence in society. But we often don't think about the state from that other angle, which is the state actually a reducer of violence? He also talks about gentle commerce. Gentle commerce as being the other factor, which has enabled us to reduce violence and live in a more peaceful world. And this was, of course, the original aim of 1945, the Bretton Woods Institution, that trade would enable us to engage with each other in new ways, connect the world, and we will become more peaceful. And so it's interesting, I think there's a lot in that hypothesis, the connections between us. However, gentle commerce is quite problematic as well when we think that actually, since the end of the Cold War, gentle commerce is around this neoliberalization of trade. So that I'm dealing at the moment in Latin America